Okay, today we're continuing our talk about the unraveling of the 1970s in modern American politics. This is American History, AMH 2020, American History since 1877. And today we're going to be talking about the period after Watergate. Nixon resigned in 1974, left American politics in limbo. This was one of the biggest scandals in U.S. politics in American history. Popular disdain for politicians was expressed in the bumper sticker, "Don't vote, it only encourages them." Watergate damaged the short-term Republican interests, but it also shifted the party to the right. Gerald Ford, who was the vice president under Nixon, was elevated to the presidency when Nixon resigned. But when it came time for him to run for re-election, he dumped the moderate Nelson Rockefeller and selected a conservative, Bob Dole, as his running mate in 1976 in an attempt to strengthen his right flank, the conservative base. So Gerald Ford, here's a picture of Gerald Ford. He was sworn in as Nixon's successor. He gave Nixon a full presidential pardon, which probably cost him re-election in 1976. It appeared to be a quid pro quo, although it may not have been, but it looked like Nixon made him vice president, and in exchange for resigning, received a promise of a presidential pardon. Nixon disappeared from public life without ever publicly apologizing, accepting responsibility, or facing charges for the cover-up. Some information on the election of 1976. A virtually unknown Georgia peanut farmer, formerly governor of Georgia, by the name of Jimmy Carter, ran against Gerald Ford and won the race by 54.8%. I'm sorry, that's how many people voted. Let's see if I can see. 50.1% against 48% for Ford. So that's a 2-point margin. Pretty close. The Electoral College vote was 297 to 240. Also reasonably close. So this was the election of 1976. You might say that it was the first election in which evangelicals turned out in large numbers to vote. I was one of those young evangelicals in 1976, and I voted for Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was the first president to unambiguously declare himself as born again. And it was around this time that the term born again became a popular catchphrase for conservative Christianity. Book by one of Nixon's hatchet men, whose name escapes me at this moment, called Born Again. And this phrase came into the public sphere as a common phrase for conservative Christians. Jimmy Carter was a born-again Christian, but he was also a relatively liberal Democrat. Liberal in relative terms within Democratic politics today, he probably would be considered moderate or even conservative. But compared to Nixon, he was certainly more liberal. So Watergate continued to weigh on voters' minds. There was a sense of disillusionment and corruption, apathy in the political sphere. The Democrats made big congressional gains in the 1974 midterm elections due to the scandal with Nixon. Ford's pardon damaged his chances to be reelected. So Jimmy Carter, a former one-term Georgia governor, he was also a nuclear physicist in the Navy. He was a peanut farmer in southern Georgia who represented a rising generation of young, racially liberal New South Democrats. This Jimmy Carter captured the nomination, and he's our oldest living president at the moment. Jimmy Carter is. He's actually 99 right now. He's in hospice care, and and he turns 100 sometime near the end of October, I believe, and he's hanging on. He wants to make it to 100, but he told his family recently that he also wants to vote for Kamala Harris. So he's got 2 reasons to hang on until early November. Jimmy Carter is a former president we can be proud of. Many people have been critical of his skills as a chief executive. He tended to be a micromanager. He tended to agonize over decisions. He was way too involved with the minutiae of government. At least that's the criticism against him. But on the plus side, he strongly oriented his foreign policy around human rights, not realpolitik or realism in international relations, which is a political theory that Nixon and Kissinger adhered to. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, and I will turn a blind eye and let my friend, who is the enemy of my enemy, do whatever they want as long as they're on my side. That was kind of the philosophy of Nixon and Kissinger. Just one example, Nixon and Kissinger turned away and looked away from terrible human rights violations in the middle 70s in Argentina by a military coup, military dictatorship, which carried out a dirty war against Argentines, any left-leaning Argentines or anyone who's perceived to be left-leaning, such as union members, college students, protesters, were rounded up, kidnapped, tortured, and then executed and disappeared. They never reemerged. Their families never knew what happened to them. That was in the mid-1970s in Argentina. It's called the Dirty War. Many times they flew these young students that they were torturing, suspected of being left-leaning. They would torture them and then fly them out of the Atlantic Ocean and drop them in the ocean. And they were never seen again. It's estimated that at least 30,000 Argentines died in this dirty war, and maybe much higher. And I don't know for a fact, but I've read and it's been reported that Kissinger gave them his tacit approval because they were anti-communist. They were the enemy of our enemies, and as long as they were anti-communist, they were pretty much allowed to do whatever they want, and there was military support and training, anti-insurgency training for the Argentine troops in the School of the Americas. That's a realism in international relationships. You accept the dark realities of human nature, and you work to the best interest of your own nationality, even when there's a human rights cost. Carter was elected in 1976. The American public was looking for something better in the political realm, something that was not so corrupt or so dark or sinister. Carter came along as a fresh face and as an idealistic young former governor, and the people voted for him. He was the anti-Nixon. He rejected Kissinger's realism in favor of human rights and peacemaking. One example is he immediately discouraged Argentina from their dirty war tactics and threatened to cut off aid to them, leading to them backing off from some of the worst of their atrocities. A few years later, he cut off military aid to Anastasio Somoza, who was a dictator in Nicaragua, and because of human rights violations and corruption in the Somoza regime, this led in a pretty much a direct line to the Nicaraguan Revolution, which overthrew Somoza and ushered in a new period in Nicaraguan history. These are 2 examples of Jimmy Carter's idealism. It was criticized as not being realistic, and he actually lost his campaign for re-election. There was an Olympic boycott in 1980. Deploring the inordinate fear of communism, Carter's efforts at improving relationships foundered, And in 1979, another thing that happened was the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Carter treated it as a major crisis and imposed an embargo on the Soviet Union and boycotted the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow, which was not terribly popular with the American public. Also, in October 1979, there was a hostage crisis that began in Iran, which actually, I would contend, you could trace back to 1954 with the CIA overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh. I think I mentioned that in an earlier lecture. And the U.S. imposed the Shah of Iran on the Iranian people. Instead of democracy, now they had a Shah, or a king. And the Iranians weren't too happy about this, and it's eventually led to a revolution in Iran in 1979, a religious revolution, pro-Islamic. And in 1979, when the clerics of Iran overthrew the government of the Shah of Iran, he was admitted to the United States for medical care. This enraged the Iranian population. Iranian students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 66 Americans hostage. President Carter suspended arms sales to Iran and froze Iranian assets. So you see that problems we're having today with Iran have roots that go far back, even back to 1954 under Eisenhower. The hostage crisis continued for 14 months. Every attempt Carter made to get them freed failed. He authorized a rescue attempt in April of 1980, but it was aborted due to equipment failures in the desert, which made him look very bad and very weak. There is some reporting that the Republican team that was running against Carter in 1980, that the future director of the CIA, William Casey, made offers to the Iranians if they would keep the hostages, keep them captured until after the election was over, that the U.S. would look favorably upon them in a Reagan administration. I don't know if that's true. If it were to be true, it would be treasonous and very dirty politics. One more picture here, the Arab-Israeli conflict. President Carter's greatest success came in his intermediation in the Arab-Israeli conflict. This was back when it was less polarized, perhaps, and there was a different regime in Israel that was more open to a two-state solution. In 1978, he invited Israel's Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat to come to Camp David and negotiated the Camp David Accords, which brought peace between Egypt and Israel and a normalization of their relations, and also began the idea of the two-state solution, which has not worked out in the meantime, unfortunately, for a number of reasons that we won't go into today. So that was the administration of Jimmy Carter. He lost to Ronald Reagan in 1980. Unfortunately, I say unfortunately, it sounds very biased, but I am an admirer of his emphasis on human rights in his foreign policy philosophy. Since he was president, he got involved with Habitat for Humanity. He and his wife would go for weeks at a time, put on a carpenter's belt and carry a hammer, and they would help build homes for the needy, for underprivileged people, for widows, for people in the margins of society. He went to Nicaragua in the 1980s as a elections observer. He has offered to negotiate in tense situations. He's been a great example of what the best a president could be after leaving the presidency. And he is still alive and is 99 years old and holding on for his 100th birthday. Up to some positive thoughts for our former president, Jimmy Carter. American politics moved to the right after Lyndon Johnson. Richard Nixon's administration was not really that conservative. Politics and society remained in flux during the 70s, swinging back and forth This is a period of ambiguity, but there was a move away from the liberal consensus towards a more conservative political view. The U.S. military floundered in Vietnam. The Middle East was a trouble spot. A cultural revolution was heating up. The sexual revolution was growing, and a conservative backlash was growing and brewing, and the pot would come to a boil in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan, which we will be talking about next. Thank you so much for your kind attention and your time. I'll see you in class. Talk to you next week. Take care.